It was the winter of 1848. The smell of pine and sawdust and damp soil thickened the air, when a California carpenter bent down into the chilly waters of the American River and pulled from its bed a few glittering flakes of gold. What he held in his hand would ignite one of the greatest societal transformations in not just the United States, but in all of human history, transforming a quiet Mexican frontier into the booming American territory forever called the Golden State. Within months, California became a beacon for dreamers, schemers, and adventurers from every corner of the globe. They came chasing fortune, and in their pursuit, they reshaped the land, its people, and the destiny of the United States itself, for better and for worse. For Footprints of the Frontier, this is the story of the California Gold Rush, its promise, its perils, and the exhilarating legends, lessons, and folklore it left behind. The folklore of frontier gold and its vast lands of treasure most Americans know begins on January 24, 1848. A carpenter named James Marshall, while working on John Sutter's sawmill along the American River, spotted a glimmer in the tail race. The glimmer in question? Gold. That single spark at Sutter's mill ignited the California Gold Rush and sent a tidal wave of humanity westward. Within months, word spread through the press, carried east by newspapers, and confirmed in Washington by President James K. Polk. From that moment forward, Sutter and Marshall were etched into American folklore. Their discovery would be remembered alongside the Comstock Lode as one of the most important mineral strikes in American history. But history is rarely that simple. Sutter's Mill was not the first place in California where gold had been unearthed. There were whispers of earlier finds, some as far back as the Mission days, when indigenous laborers are said to have stumbled upon traces of the metal and quietly turned them over to the friars. Those padres, fearing what chaos a rush might bring, hushed those rumors into silence. 6 years before Marshall's famous discovery, another strike had already been made, and this one too was no accident. In 1842, in what is now the Santa Clarita Valley, Rancho San Francisco became the site of the first authenticated gold discovery in California. The land had been granted 3 years earlier by Governor Juan Bautista Alvarado to Lieutenant Antonio de Valle, a Mexican officer. On March 9th of that year, a rancher named Francisco Lopez, educated in mineralogy at the University of Mexico, uncovered gold on the property. Legend says he had been napping beneath an old oak tree, Canyon de los Encinos, when he dreamed of floating on a pool of gold. On waking, he pulled wild onions from the soil, only to find their roots glittering with the metal. Other versions claim he was rounding up cattle when he stumbled across the onions. However it happened, Lopez was not alone. Manuel Cota and Domingo Bermudez witnessed the find and helped gather samples that were sent to Los Angeles merchant Abel Stearns. From there, the gold was forwarded to the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia, where it assayed at 926 fine, worth $19 an ounce. On April 4th, 1842, Lopez and his companions formally petitioned Governor Alvarado for the right to mine. That petition explicitly places the discovery at Rancho San Francisco. It stands as the first official record of gold in California, sparking the delusions of grandeur that would multiply in the coming years. What followed was a modest rush. Hundreds of miners, most of them from Sonora, Mexico, poured into Placerita Canyon. The name itself comes from placer, referring to surface gold deposits found in sand and gravel. By November of that year, some 200 ounces had been collected. By 1848, the yield had grown to more than 1,300 pounds, with some of it struck into Mexican escudos. Ignacio de Valle, son of the original grantee, became head of California's first mining district. He drafted regulations for the digging years before American miners began organizing their own codes in the Sierra Nevada. But after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, many of the Sonoran miners returned home, and Lopez's strike soon faded from memory. When the rush of '48 swept into the Sierra foothills, Sutter and Marshall became the names remembered, while Lopez's discovery was quietly relegated to obscurity. Still, traces of the story remained. In October 1842, the New York Observer carried a report on California gold near San Fernando, noting pieces as large as $1/8 of a dollar and claiming that thousands of dollars had already been collected. In 1845, John Bidwell himself passed through Placerita Canyon during a brief imprisonment near Mission San Fernando and saw the gold operations with his own eyes. Bidwell had actually already seen gold in California once before, but the timing and the politics of the conquest buried that earlier chapter beneath the American story of Sutter's Mill, a story that was about to change the course of a nation's history, again, for better or for worse. Alta California, the land that would one day become the state of California, had already lived under 3 flags before gold was ever struck at Sutter's Mill. First settled under the Viceroyalty of New Spain in the late 17th century, it passed into Mexican hands after independence in 1821. A quarter century later, the Mexican-American War brought United States troops into the region. By 1846, California was firmly overrun by American forces, with a ceasefire reached early the next year. When the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was ratified in May of 1848, California formally passed from Mexico to the United States. By then, however, the earth had already begun to give up its secrets. At the heart of this story stood John Augustus Sutter, a German-Swiss settler who had carved out his own fiefdom in the Sacramento Valley. By the late 1840s, Sutter controlled houses, lands, herds, mills, and a workforce of both artisans and native laborers. He fancied himself a man of progress, building a colony that would resist the drift into frontier lawlessness. But his vision required lumber, for fences, for flour mills, for sale to San Francisco. The nearest forests and streams capable of powering a sawmill lay in the Sierra foothills, some 20 miles east of his fort. Though his plans were delayed by the war, Sutter soon resumed the search. The place chosen was known to the local Nishinan people as Columa, meaning beautiful vale. Nestled along the South Fork of the American River, it was a valley of red soil and light vegetation, ringed by hills and oak groves. For centuries, that spot had been a quiet home for the Nishinan, but Sutter's men brought axes and guns, breaking the silence with the construction of a sawmill. This unlikely place would become the stage for one of the most consequential discoveries in world history. Sutter entrusted the task to James Wilson Marshall, a 33-year-old carpenter from New Jersey. Marshall had drifted westward through the frontier, farming and working as a mechanic, before finally arriving in California. He had already lost one property during the tumult of the Mexican-American War, and when he rejoined Sutter in 1845, he was as a skilled builder. Marshall explored the foothills throughout the spring of 1847, sometimes with Sutter at his side, searching for the right combination of water-powered timber and road access. In May, guided by natives and accompanied by white companions, he settled on Columa as the best site. By late summer, Marshall had signed a partnership agreement with Sutter. Supplies, tools, and food were hauled into the mountains by ox carts. A double log house went up first, followed by smaller cabins closer to the mill. By the turn of the new year, the mill frame was standing, and a brush dam had been completed. Floods proved a constant menace, and the tail race, the channel meant to carry water away from the saw, had to be blasted and dug through dry soil. The workforce itself was a mixed band, a handful of white men, many of them former soldiers from the disbanded Mormon battalion, alongside those native laborers. Families, though, were present as well. Peter Wimmer, with his wife and children, oversaw much of the digging. Henry Bigler worked the drills. Charles Bennett and William Scott handled bench work, and others felled timber or hauled with their whipsaws. The camp was alive with easy banter, Mexican sombreros and bright sashes giving color to the rough frontier scene. Marshall himself was a curious figure, of medium build with coarse features and piercing eyes. He was both practical and prone to abstract notions, a man of skill, but also of sudden moodiness. Some found him taciturn and surly, others thought him visionary. Above all, he was an obstinate worker who refused to give up a task once set upon it. It was on the afternoon of January 24, 1848, while inspecting the newly dug tail race after a rain, that Marshall noticed yellow particles glinting in the soil. Scooping some onto a tin plate, he washed the dirt and found the flecks held fast. They separated like metal, not sand, and the value, amounted to perhaps a dime's worth, was small, unmistakable. That evening, he turned to his companions and said quietly, "Boys, I believe I have found a gold mine." They laughed him off. "No such luck," came the reply. But Marshall was not mistaken. He had just uncovered the strike that would change the course of California, and with it, the world. At first light, on January 25th, James Marshall walked the length of the sawmill's tail race. The sluice gate had already been closed through the night, and the water now ran clear. Beneath the current, he spotted another glimmer, and reaching down, he plucked up a piece larger than before, worth about $50. He tested it as any frontiers might, weighing it in his hand, biting it, and hammering it between stones. Each trial confirmed what he had already suspected. Before the morning was out, he had gathered nearly 3 ounces of gold flakes, some no larger than a pinhead, others approaching the size of a pea. Half he tucked away in a pouch, and 2 days later, with the evidence secure, he rode down to New Helvetia to present his findings to Sutter. On the afternoon of January 28th, Marshall asked for a private meeting with the man who held his fortunes in hand. Sutter, wary but intrigued, gathered what was needed for an assay: bowls of water, a stick of redwood, twine, and sheet copper for a makeshift scale. He then reached for more precise tools, his apothecary's balance, and a vial of aquafortis. The acid test proved it. In a further trial, comparing the gold's weight against silver coins in water, confirmed it beyond doubt. To be certain, Sutter even consulted the American Encyclopedia. There it was, in print. That yellow metal Marshall had found was genuine American gold. That night, Marshall rode back into the dark, rain at his back, unable to keep the discovery to himself. Sutter scarcely slept. He had dreamed of building an empire on agriculture, mills, and trade. But now he feared that fate had delivered a curse. Gold would draw laborers away from the plow and the saw, and leave his project in ruins. On January 29th, Sutter mounted his horse and rode for the mill. He met Marshall on the trail, and together they returned to the site. The water was shut off, and the men bent to the work of collecting specimens. Gold showed itself along the tailrace, in tributary ravines, and on the banks of the river itself. Sutter carried away a ring-shaped piece weighing just 1.5 ounces, proof enough of what lay beneath the valley. Yet instead of triumph, he saw misfortune. If word spread, his men would scatter surely. Secrecy was now paramount, at least until his flour mill could be completed. But secrecy? Well, secrecy was a fragile thing. On February 10th, Sutter broke it himself, writing to General Vallejo with word of a, quote, rich gold mine. At nearly the same time, Charles Bennett was dispatched to Monterey with instructions to secure land and mineral rights from Colonel Richard Mason. He was told, do not speak of gold. Yet, Bennett carried 6 ounces of it in his bag, and before long, temptation won. At Benicia, when the talk turned to coal, Bennett produced his own glittering samples. In San Francisco, he showed them to Isaac Humphrey, a man with mining experience in Georgia, who confirmed, beyond question, again that his find was real. At Monterey, Mason refused to grant any legal assurances, but Bennett could not resist boasting of the strike. The secret unraveled further still. A Swiss teamster, entrusted to carry provisions, of course drank too much and revealed the story in town after being shown specimens by the Wimmer family. Sutter's own schooner carried gold downriver, where men like Folsom, John Bidwell, and eventually the storekeeper Samuel Brannan learned of the find. What began as whispers among mill hands was now ripping outward across the settlements. In those first months, the sawmill community tried to honor its contracts. They had pledged 6 weeks of work, and they did finish the mill by March. But on Sundays, their labor shifted from timber to river sand. Using only knives at first, they scratched gold from the banks, making $3 to $8 a day. Crude wooden scales weighed the dust against Mexican silver coins, though the early estimates undervalued the metal at $16 an ounce. By February, discoveries multiplied. On the 6th, Henry Bigler and James Barger took $10 worth from across the river. Within 2 weeks, Bigler was quietly mining under the pretense of hunting game, his daily take rising from half an ounce to more than 1. In another instance, Marshall and another companion, James Gregson, stumbled onto Live Oak Bar and picked up nearly a pint of gold by hand. News then quickly spread through the Mormon battalion. Bigler wrote to comrades, and by late February, men like Sidney Willis and Hudson were testing the ground for themselves. Soon, Mormon diggings and Mormon Island were marked on the maps of early miners. Some of the battalion, still bound by duty to reach Salt Lake, resisted the lure, but others, well, the resistance was impossible. They had sailed aboard the ship Brooklyn, or marched with a battalion across deserts, only to arrive at Sutter's fort in need of provisions. Waiting for supplies, they too discovered gold. By April and May, many had settled along the river, with some earning as much as $250 a day at Mormon Island. On June 17th, they gathered for the long journey east. A wagon train of 45 men and 1 woman set out, their spirits high. On Independence Day 1848, as they crossed the Sierra, they fired cannons in celebration. Yet the mountains took their toll. At Pleasant Valley, tragedy struck when 3 pioneers were killed in an attack. Still, the survivors pressed on. They carried with them not just wagons and provisions, but the news of California's gold, which could now not be contained. The potential for westward migration was bursting at the seams. Dreams of golden sugar plums danced in the heads of countless folk, looking to finally act on their hopes of an American fortune. Gold fever was the diagnosis. The prescription? Building the yellow brick road. The discovery at Sutter's mill did not spread like a thunderclap. At first, it lingered in half-whispered conversations, little more than another rumor in a land already familiar with false starts. Reports of gold were so common around the world that they were often met with skepticism, and California was no different. In February and March of 1848, men of influence, Vallejo, Semple, and even Captain Folsom, laughed at the news. Folsom himself mistook the first flakes for mica, and when presented with nearly 20 ounces, he still doubted. Newspapers in San Francisco mentioned the find only in passing. On March 15th, the Californian ran a single short paragraph. 3 days later, the California Star offered a casual note without commentary. The people paid it little mind. To most, farming still looked like a more reliable enterprise. But by April, curiosity began to stir. E.C. Kemble, editor of the Star, slipped away in secret to inspect the mines himself. When he returned, he hinted at what he had seen, though he held back the details. Others followed the same pattern, denying their destination, only to disappear toward the American River. The rumors grew stronger with every bottle, tin can, or buckskin pouch filled with shining dust that returned to town. Then came the spark that set San Francisco ablaze. In early May, Samuel Brannan, shopkeeper, Mormon elder, and man of commerce, strode through the city streets, waving a vial of gold dust and shouting at the top of his lungs, "Gold! Gold! Gold from the American River!" In that moment, the city changed overnight. By late spring, the exodus was underway. Men abandoned their shops and homes, dissolved partnerships, set out for the mines. The bay filled with launches, sloops, and even rafts, lashed together from scrap timber, all bound upriver. Overland, wagons clogged the passes near Livermore and Sausalito. At the ferry crossings, like the one at Martinez, hundreds of teams stood waiting their turn. Comfort was abandoned. Many went without blankets or provisions, but no man forgot to bring a shovel. The price of tools skyrocketed. A spade that once cost $1 now fetched 10. By June, San Francisco was hollowed out. 3/4 of its men had gone. Businesses shuttered, construction ceased, and even the council and church closed their doors. The Californian stopped printing on May 29th, and the Star followed suit on June 14th. Real estate collapsed, labor prices soared, and the wharves filled with deserted ships. Their crews vanished into the foothills. A Peruvian brig sailing into the empty harbor found the great city of the Pacific reduced to little more than silence. The fever spread like wildfire across California. San Jose, Monterey, Los Angeles, and even San Diego. All were left reeling as their populations vanished. Judges, alcaldes, soldiers, and doctors abandoned their posts. Prisons lost their guards, and in some cases, the guards themselves joined the rush. In Monterey, nearly 1,000 people left town in a single week. Governor Mason found himself nearly alone, cooking his own meals in the government house, stripped of its servants. The military fared no better. Desertions reached epidemic levels. On July 25th, Mason issued a proclamation pleading with citizens to arrest runaways. Officers either deserted outright or demanded leave. In some cases, they simply hired replacements at exorbitant wages, $300 a month for a cook, all while taking their pay in rations. Commodore Thomas admitted that desertion had gotten beyond his control. Only when the army was nearly stripped bare did the hemorrhage slow. There were, however, a few steady voices amid the madness. Old Luis Peralta, then near 100 years of age, warned his sons not to chase the fleeting promises of the river. Farming, he insisted, would endure when the mines had gone silent. A handful of others recognized the greater opportunities in land, trade, and shipping. But theirs were lonely voices, drowned in the roar of fortune seekers. Meanwhile, the circle of discovery had widened. Isaac Humphrey, the seasoned miner from Georgia, arrived at Coloma on March 7th. Within days, he had introduced the rocker, the first true machine of California mining. Skeptics laughed when he invited them to join, but soon his rocker was paying the steady returns. By spring, John Bidwell had tested the sands near his rancho at Chico and discovered what became Bidwell Bar on the Feather River. Peter Lassen's old associate, P.B. Reading, opened Clear Creek with the help of his native laborers. Everywhere prospectors turned, up the tributaries of the South Fork, along the Feather, and across the Sacramento Valley, gold was waiting. By May, perhaps 800 miners were at work. By June, Thomas Larkin estimated the number had grown to 2,000, half of them foreigners. By July, Governor Mason found 4,000 men digging when he made his official inspection. And by October, the figure had doubled again. What had begun with Marshall's handful of dust was now drawing the attention of not just the country, but of the world. By the summer of 1848, the foothills of the Sierra Nevada had become a hive of activity, dotted with camps springing up wherever gold was rumored to lie. Along the Feather River, Potter staked his claim and opened up what became known as Potter Bar. Long Bar and Adamstown soon followed, with groups like Davis and his indigenous laborers pulling in staggering amounts, over 270 pounds in just 7 weeks. John Bidwell himself, recognizing the potential, turned from his own mining to running a trading post, while native workers dug independently. The Yuba River proved equally rich. In July, 5 men uncovered deposits that yielded a fortune, $75,000 in only 3 months. Along its bar, miners made $60 to $100 a day, though crude tools meant much of the wealth slipped through their fingers. On the American River, John Sinclair oversaw 50 native miners at their junction of its north and south branches by June. Mormon prospectors soon uncovered the Spanish Bar, one of the richest sites in the region, eventually yielding over $1 million. Others, like the Irishman Yankee Jim, struck upon ravines that became some of the most famous diggings in California. Camps like Illinois Town, Iowa Hill, and Todd Valley followed, while Mormon settlers themselves shifted into tavern keeping, founding establishments like the Mormon House and Franklin House. What began as dry diggings soon took on a more permanent moniker, Auburn. South of Coloma, men tested the earth along Weber Creek. Charles Weber himself organized a formal mining company there, though by September, he had dissolved it in favor of building the town that would bear his name, Stockton. Meanwhile, other diggings sprang up nearby, including the infamous camp of Hangtown, later renamed Placerville. Discovered by William Daler's party, its riches were legendary. men gathered between 3 ounces and 5 pounds a day. By that summer, 300 miners called it home, boasting themselves, quote, "the happiest men in the universe." The San Joaquin Valley and the southern mines were not far behind. Jose Jesus, once an alcalde at San Jose, partnered with Weber to train a band of 25 tribesmen in gold mining. Their first efforts on Weber Creek quickly spread to the Stanislaus River, where their finds were even coarser and richer. Soon, new camps dotted the landscape. At one particular camp, called Wood Creek, a trio of men scraped out as much as $200 or $300 a day, with nothing more than knives and picks. Further south, Antonio Coronel of Los Angeles arrived with a party in August 1848, guided by both rumor and chance meetings with men already carrying sacks of gold. His group struck pay dirt, recording daily hauls of 40 or 50 ounces. A Sonoran miner named Chino Tirador stumbled on a pocket so rich he filled a tray in hours, only to lose it all in a night of gambling. Such tales became common, the ease of sudden wealth matched only by the speed with which it slipped away. By autumn, Sonora had emerged as the great southern hub, its Mexican miners giving the camp its name and its character. By the close of 1848, the entire gold-bearing stretch of California, running from the Feather River in the north down to Tuolumne in the south, had been prospected. The miners were a mixed company: Mormons, Californios, Mexicans, French Canadians, Oregonians, native laborers, and many, many more. The gold fields of California spread quickly after 1848, from the patchy southern diggings to the rich, steady bars of the northern rivers. Ultimately, the American River became the center of it all, its flume channels feeding camps like Coloma, Placerville, and Georgetown. Nevada County gained fame with the blue lead and early quartz discoveries at Grass Valley, while Yuba, Sierra, and Plumas produced staggering nuggets and deep gravel beds. Further north, Shasta, Trinity, and Eureka boomed, and southward, the motherlode of Amador, Calaveras, and Mariposa promised sudden fortunes in coarse gold. Even as the coastal ranges turned instead to coal and quicksilver, the patchwork of camps and counties together defined California's legendary mining frontier. Life in these camps carried a familiar rhythm: quick riches, endless new rumors, the clang of gold pans mixing with the rattle of dice and the clink of bottles. For every fortune won, another was lost at the card table. The miners of 1848 were, in many ways, different from the wave that would follow in 49. These first men were often local Californians, settlers with families, and their native retainers. Crime was rare and just as swift when it did occur. Horse thieves and gold robbers were tied and hanged, though punishments fell hardest on Latinos, whose claims were often seized by Anglo miners. Still, for a brief moment, honesty and neighborliness seemed to mark the camps. Of course, that would not last. The work itself was punishing. Men stood knee-deep in frigid rivers under the burning sun, their tools little more than knives, pans, and crude wooden rockers. Pay dirt was carried on shoulders from dry gulches to streams, or water hauled back the other way. Yet the abundance of gold met even crude methods paid handsomely. Average returns ran a full ounce a day, $16 to $20 at the time, the equivalent of over $1,000 for a season's work. Some earned far more, $100 to $700 a day in the richest spots. Altogether, by year's end, $10 million in gold had been pulled from California's earth by only 8 to 10,000 men. Gold itself was undervalued in those first months. Traders cheated the miners, offering just $4 to $10 an ounce for dust worth 16 or more. Native tribes at first traded it away cheaply until they learned to demand fixed rates. Even so, inflated prices ate away at earnings. $20 for a yard of calico, 30 ounces for a serape. Horses that cost hundreds were ridden once and discarded. It seemed as though the gold would never run out. But hardships gnawed at the margins. Sickness was very common. Fever, dysentery, and scurvy plagued the camps. Shelter was little more than brush shanties or crude log huts. With the October rains, rivers swelled, claims flooded, and the season came to an abrupt halt. Many a man returned to towns ragged, sick, and penniless. Others stayed on, building permanent settlements from the chaos. At the center of it all stood Sutter's Fort, the hub for northern and central mines. Goods flowed through its gates. Stores, ferries, freight wagons, traders, miners, and natives, all crowding the once sleepy outpost. Merchants in San Francisco grew rich almost overnight, some claiming sales of $30,000 in a matter of weeks. For Sutter and Marshall, however, the discovery that had set all this in motion brought only ruin. Marshall wandered into spiritualism, claiming visions and phantom beckonings. He grew paranoid, surly, and unwelcome, his life sinking into poverty until his obscure death in Coloma decades later. Sutter fared little better. Despite his immense landholdings, livestock, and trade hub, he mismanaged every opportunity. His mills stood idle as workers fled to the mines. His attempts at mining and trade himself collapsed. Retreating to his hog farm, he lived out his life embittered, incapable of competing the noisy, grasping Yankee world around him. California later granted both men token recognition. Pensions and portraits hung up in the state capitol, but many argued they deserved little more. Marshall had stumbled upon gold by accident and wasted the chance it gave him. Sutter had squandered every advantage through weakness. Compared with other men who deliberately sought and found gold, California's discoverers were more the victims of fate than its masters. However, fate would still change the lives of many, many, many more men soon to follow. The dog days of 1848 were underway, and the rumor of California's gold had begun to slip beyond the valleys of the Sierra and across the Pacific Ocean. At first, it was little more than whispers, news carried eastward by disbanded Mormon battalion men, or by San Francisco merchants who saw in it a chance to encourage migration and trade. Couriers were sent out as early as April, carrying copies of the California Star that hinted at riches waiting in the riverbeds. From the Hawaiian Islands, word spread north to Oregon, through the Hudson's Bay Company, and on into British Columbia. By August, the fever had drained half of Oregon's workforce southward. In Sonora, Mexico, the reaction was nothing short of hysteria, quote, mania beyond all description, as one account put it. Thousands packing up and streaming north toward the promise of gold. Official confirmation trickled in more slowly. On June 1st, Thomas O'Larkin sent the first dispatch east. Not until September did Lieutenant Edward Beale carry Mason's report by way of Mexico. By September 20th, the Baltimore Sun carried the story, and by December 5th, President Polk himself stood before Congress, holding California gold dust in his hand. That moment turned rumor into certainty. Newspapers across the United States printed Mason's report, and soon it spread worldwide. The timing could not have been more perfect for the fever to take hold. America was flush with disbanded soldiers from the Mexican-American War, men restless and adrift. Immigration to the United States was already surging, and money sat idle in eastern banks. Suddenly, the talk of every tavern, church, and theater was gold. Songs were written, sermons preached, and plays staged on the theme. Ministers, farmers, bankrupt merchants, and sex workers alike fixed their eyes westward. The hysteria struck America's great seaports hardest. Bakers worked night and day to supply hardtack for departing ships. Gunmakers, tool shops, and smithies turned out picks, pans, and revolvers by the tens of thousands. Inventors promised miracle machines to scoop gold from riverbeds, dredges, diving bells, and cranks that often broke before they worked. On city streets, immigrant companies formed, parties of 10 or 100, pooling their money to charter ships, outfit mills, or build prefabricated houses they meant to reassemble in California. Most of these associations would collapse once faced with the harsh reality of the journey, but the enthusiasm was real. By the close of 1848, the first ships were already departing. In November and December, 61 vessels cleared East Coast ports, bound for California. By spring, that number had swelled to 250, with as many as 45 ships arriving in San Francisco in a single day. Old whalers and merchant hulks were refitted for passengers, often dangerously. Panama and Nicaragua groaned under the weight of stranded immigrants, victims of false promises and corruption. Hundreds died from malaria, cholera, thirst, and starvation. Still, they pressed on. The men who made this journey were largely respectable: the merchants, the clerks, and the farmers who could afford the steep fares. But scattered among them were the gamblers, the criminals, and the outcasts, all hoping to reinvent themselves at the diggings. The majority were young, hardy men. Women were few, and those who lived near the coast favored the sea passage. Men from the interior waited for spring and the overland trails to open up. California fever was no American monopoly. In London, England, 5 gold companies were organized in early 1849, backed by more than £1 million of capital. Ships were outfitted from nearly every European port. In China, the promise of Gold Mountain drew thousands, the gambling spirit of the age feeding the rush. The Philippines, especially the folks of Manila, also caught the fever. The Marquesas Islands saw soldiers desert their posts. South in Australia, city walls were plastered with, quote, "Golden California" notices. By September 1848, ships were already carrying Peruvians and Chileans northward, their departure even preceding the Great American Migration. Those who crossed Panama became the most celebrated of all, the, quote, "New Argonauts," as the newspapers called them. The mythic comparisons rolled easily off the tongue. Jason and his Argonauts had chased the Golden Fleece. Now Americans chased the yellow dust through the Golden Gate. The fever was described as a disease, its victims gold bugs, whose very blood seemed poisoned with greed and hope. The Pacific Mail Steamship Company, incorporated in 1848, became the chief artery of this migration. Its 3 vessels, the California, the Oregon, and the Panama, were launched just as the news reached a global audience. The California sailed from New York in October, arriving at Panama by January 1849. It was there where chaos reigned. Thousands crowded into the town of Chagres, jamming its muddy streets and rotting taverns. The only way across was by canoe up the Chagres River, then by mule over an ancient stone trail to Panama City. Disease again ravaged the emigrants. Animals were scarce, and many abandoned their belongings along the road. When the California finally arrived in Panama, it was besieged by over 1,500 passengers, though it could carry only a fraction of that. Still, more than 400 crammed aboard, steerage passengers paying as much as $1,000. The same scenes played out when the Oregon and the Panama arrived in the months that followed. Some immigrants, stranded by broken promises, attempted desperate canoe voyages up the Pacific coast. It goes without saying, many died. But when the California finally steamed into San Francisco Bay on February 28, 1849, the scene was jubilant. Naval guns thundered a salute. Ships in the harbor unfurled bunting, and crowds cheered as though witnessing the dawn of a new age. That voyage, and those of the Oregon and Panama, passed quickly into legend. Their passengers were remembered as pioneers, celebrated with annual reunions for decades to come. By the spring of 1849, the flood of humanity pouring into California came not only by sea, but also across the vast, forbidding heart of the continent. The overland migration equaled the maritime rush in scale, though its trials were infinitely harsher. These wagon trains were the heirs of Fremont's surveys, of Bidwell's trek in the 1840s, and of the Oregon and Mormon trails before them. The same ruts worn by trappers and emigrants now groaned under the wheels of gold seekers. Proper organization was essential. No man, however determined, could face the wilderness alone. Caravans banded together for protection and logistics, electing captains to lead them, pooling money for wagons, oxen, and their provisions. Farmers who already owned stock and wagons stood at a massive advantage. Poor men found their way west by driving teams or working as assistants. The main gathering points were the Missouri River towns, St. Joseph, and Independence, where by late April, some 20,000 immigrants were encamped, waiting for the grass to grow on the plains. By May and early June, the official exodus began. Long trains of wagons rolling westward, beneath banners scrawled with slogans like, quote, "Ho for the diggings." The first days were almost festive. Men sang around the campfires, women cooked while the cattle grazed, and children played among the wagons. Travel began at dawn, halted in late afternoon, and ended with the wagons circled into corrals for safety. But soon, the reality set in. Disputes broke out over leadership, routes, and rules. Caravans split. Mutinous men left to make their own way. The hardships of the trail were relentless. From the tall grass prairies, immigrants moved into sterile plains, then onto swamps, deserts, and mountains. The Platte River, the Black Hills, South Pass, the Green River, and Fort Hall marked the slow march westward, each landmark bought at the price of exhaustion. Beyond lay the Humboldt River, leading into a wasteland of alkali dust and shimmering mirages that pioneers would call the Valley of Death. Cattle dropped dead by the thousands, wagons were abandoned, and vultures and coyotes trailed the stricken trains. By the time survivors staggered into the Sacramento Valley, many were on foot, gaunt and fevered, their wagons reduced to little more than wreckage. In 1849, a new terror accompanied them: cholera. The disease swept from the Mississippi Valley into the wagon camps, striking hardest among those who started late. An estimated 5,000 died along the trail that year. Graves lined the roadside, many torn open by wolves. Fear grew so great that the sick were sometimes abandoned, though there were also stirring examples of devotion, families clinging together until the bitter end. To many, cholera was the divine punishment from God. due to their lust for gold. The journey was not without its visions. Along the Platte, buffalo and antelope filled the horizon, while hunters brought down elk and wild turkey. Yet the rivers themselves could be deadly. Crossings on rafts and ferries often ended in disaster. Women and children, weakened by scurvy, fever, and starvation, bore the worst of the suffering, often forced to walk mile after mile under the broiling sun. Some immigrants halted at Salt Lake City, trading those wagons and tools in to the Mormons for provisions. Others pressed onward in small detachments, many of which perished in the desert. Relief parties sent from California rescued some, but not all. The latecomers of 1850 fared even worse. Misled by glowing promises of cheap provisions in California, they set out under-provisioned. The Humboldt overflow forced them into barren uplands, where animals collapsed by the thousands, and cholera returned with fury. Snow blocked the passes, trapping whole parties at once. Many ate carrion, drank from poisoned pools, or simply gave in to despair. Reports of that year's migration spoke of suffering, quote, unparalleled. Not all came by the northern route. Thousands entered through the south, following the Santa Fe Trail, the Old Spanish Trail, or Cook's Gila route through the deserts of Arizona and into Los Angeles. Others came by way of Texas or through Mexican seaports. By the year's end, some 100,000 newcomers had entered California, roughly 39,000 by sea and 42,000 by land, with thousands more through Mexico. Those who survived the overland ordeal reached California wary, but hardened. They were mostly farmers and frontier folk, rugged, industrious, self-reliant, and many chose to stay, planting their roots in the new land. By contrast, those men who came by sea included more of the transient adventurers, those gamblers and the restless spirits who drifted from camp to camp. Together, as the newfound 49ers, they formed the foundation of a new California society. Life for the folk who came to California in 1849 was unlike anything most of them had known before. The gold rush created communities that were overwhelmingly male, restless, and transient. By 1850, fewer than 8% of California's total population were women, and in the mining country, the figure was closer to 2%. The camps were dominated by young men, with hardly an elder to be found, and the blend of languages, customs, and nationalities was so diverse that many likened it to a Babylonian confusion of tongues. Americans, particularly Yankees, formed the backbone of the mining society, bringing with them energy, adaptability, and political influence. But alongside them were British and German immigrant laborers, French artisans, Mexicans and Chileans, Chinese sojourners, Pacific Islanders, and even men from the Ottoman Empire, Africa, and India. While all of them came for gold, not all were welcomed. White jealousy hurt Mexican and South American miners, who were far more experienced and reaped more rewards. Latino communities kept to themselves, in part because of mistreatment, and though the Chinese did not arrive in large numbers until the early 1850s, they too would become targets of violent hostility. The miners themselves cut a rough but unmistakable figure: wool shirts in red or blue, kerchiefs, trousers stuffed into boots, pistols at the belt, hair grown long, and beards untamed. Gamblers set themselves apart with a more flamboyant Mexican flair: bright sashes, broad hats, and gold chains. In the towns, especially San Francisco, A small class of men began to dress in black coats and stovepipe hats, but among the miners, such dandyism was scorned. Clean hands and white shirts were marks of preachers or gamblers, not men who swung picks and pans. Equality was enforced by custom as much as law. Nicknames like Sandy Pete or Long-Legged Jack replaced formality, and partnerships between, quote, pards often carried more loyalty than blood ties. California bred a peculiar energy in those years. Men worked with a vigor that astonished travelers, digging, hauling, and the panning for hours under the burning sun, then gambling or drinking deep into the night. Recklessness seemed to permeate the air. Few intended to stay. Most dreamed of one rich strike that would allow them to return east in triumph. Yet generosity matched the greed. Haggling was scorned, and miners often gave freely, confident that more gold could be had the next day. Wages were among the highest in the world, with common laborers making $1 an hour and artisans far more. And the old ranks of society blurred. Lawyers became ditch diggers, clerks became merchants, and farmers turned into speculators overnight. But with prosperity came disorder. At first, mining camps were surprisingly safe, valuables left unguarded, strangers trusted. But that quickly changed. Fugitives and drifters flooded in, and crime rose sharply. Theft was considered more outrageous than murder, but both were very common. Duels were fought openly, often announced in advance, while lynchings and vigilante justice became a fact of life, especially in the northern and central districts. Even San Francisco resorted to vigilante committees by 1851, when its police force proved ineffective. Camps often fell under the sway of bullies, gamblers, and loafers, while honest miners struggled to keep the order. Disease and death were constant companions. The harsh work, poor shelter, and bad diet led to fevers, rheumatism, scurvy, and lung ailments. Cholera struck Sacramento in 1850, killing 15% of the city. Many immigrants arrived already weakened by their voyages, crammed into filthy ships with foul water and spoiled food. Winters brought starvation, and suicide was not uncommon among the destitute. Doctors were few and costly, the hospitals overcrowded, and burials were often just crude affairs in shallow ground, though miners did sometimes stop their work to hold a somber procession for a fallen comrade. The scarcity of women left its own mark on California society. In the camps, a single woman was a spectacle, almost always a sex worker, and in the towns, sex workers dominated the public stage in those first years. Yet because women were so rare, they were often idolized. Hardened men wept at the sight of a little girl, and nearly any woman of respectable bearing could expect marriage. As more women arrived in the 1850s, particularly those better educated and intent on making homes, the tone of society slowly shifted towards stability. And in the meantime, men made do in their own way. Without servants, many learned to cook and keep house themselves, or relied on immigrant labor from the Irish, French, Italians, and eventually Chinese. Housing was often little more than shacks, tents, or ramshackle hotels plagued by fleas and rats. Privacy was rare, and laundry cost a fortune. For many, the saloon offered the only comfort, a bright, lively refuge compared to the grimness of a bunkhouse. Drinking was constant, less in bouts of drunkenness than in a steady stream of glasses raised with company. In those days, to drink alone was frowned upon. Saloon keepers, in turn, became very influential figures, caretakers of community, arbiters in disputes, and often the only men of high standing in settlements where law and order lagged behind fortune. If there was one pastime that defined life in the California diggings, it was gambling. The mines themselves were a gamble, and that spirit carried over into every saloon and shantytown in the Sierra foothills. Nearly every settlement boasted gaming tables, and in San Francisco, gambling houses grew into elaborate, gaudy halls ablaze with light. Faro, Monte, roulette, blackjack, and dice were the games of choice, with stakes sometimes climbing as high as $45,000 on a single turn of the cards. Mexican gamblers carried a reputation for calm composure at the table, while Americans were said to play with a wild, reckless passion. Respectable professional gamblers cultivated a certain air of polish in their dress. But by the early 1850s, the tide had begun to turn. San Francisco banned Sunday gambling in 1851, and though the cards never truly disappeared from the mining country, the fever burned brightest in those first few years. Other diversions filled the frontier calendar. Lotteries offering jewelry, land, and even houses were common, and blood sports that carried over from the Mexican era flourished. Bullfights, cockfights, and even brutal contests that pitted bulls against bears drew eager crowds. Prize fighting and horse racing had their place, as did public celebrations, fireworks, parades, and formal balls. The missions and gardens that had once been the quiet centers of California life were turned into festive gathering grounds. By 1849, professional entertainers had joined the amateur theatricals that miners staged in towns like Sonoma and Monterey. But it was San Francisco that became a center for the stage, with its National Theater and the Jenny Lind Theater, both opened in 1850, though the city's repeated fires destroyed them more than once. Drama was considered a more respectable outlet than gambling or drinking, and female vocalists in particular drew adoring audiences. Religion, by contrast, struggled to keep a foothold. For many, the long voyage west had broken old habits of Sabbath observance. Sunday in the camps was reserved not for church, but for washing clothes, mending, baking bread, writing letters, gathering in the saloons and markets. Clergy were present in the larger towns, but their audiences were meager compared to the crowds thronging gambling halls or listening to a brass band on a holiday. Most miners deferred religion until the day they returned home. Prospectors formed the restless vanguard of the mining population, carrying only the barest kit: bread, salt, a pan, pick and a shovel, blanket and rifle. They struck off into the dry watercourses, gravel hills, and hidden ravines, searching for untouched bars of gold. Many discoveries came by accident, but secrets never lasted long. A single whisper at a campfire was enough to launch a rush. New camps would spring up overnight, brush huts and tents at first, then mule trains hauling in supplies, saloons, and hotels. Mining methods grew more ambitious as the easy pickings dwindled. Shafts and tunnels were driven into hillsides, riverbeds were diverted, and flumes and ditches snaked for miles across the landscape. The mining camp itself revolved around its main street, a row of saloons, gambling dens, and general stores. Violence was rare compared to the fear many expected, but alcohol fueled its share of trouble, and the sight of armed men often kept disputes from boiling over. Sundays brought miners in from miles around, not for the worship, but for those markets, cards, and a strong, stiff drink. Storekeepers, like saloon keepers in the early camps, wielded real power in these communities. often more than the gamblers, for they controlled the goods every miner depended on. The camps were also filled with recognizable characters: the blustering bully, the overdressed dandy, the rowdy Irishman, the jovial Dutchman, the superstitious sailor, relaxed Hispanos, and native people pushed to the margins. Even preachers and deacons appeared now and again, railing against vice, while sometimes succumbing to it themselves. As winter closed in, miners abandoned their tents for sturdier log or clapboard cabins. These homes were crude: floors of sod, roofs of bark, doors of rough-hewn timber. Inside, canvas beds and straw bolsters were arranged beside makeshift tables, shelves with a few treasured books, cracked mirrors, and rough hearths. The meals were plain but hearty: salt pork, beans, chops, coffee, flapjacks, and coarse bread. And again, Sundays often became the day for cooking, the mending, and the rest. Evenings were spent around the fire, swapping tales and singing songs, or simply falling into reverie. For the young men who made up the bulk of the 49ers, the hardships were outweighed by the freedom of adventure of the lifestyle. Fortunes were won and squandered in the same season, and many who once pocketed small fortunes still ended their lives in poverty. Others were able to turn their energy and ingenuity towards more permanent ventures, forming companies to dig tunnels, build ditches, or open quartz mines. However, the California gold rush was never a steady march forward. It was a series of explosions, excitements, and false alarms that sent men scattering across the frontier in search of fortune. You see, the prospecting spirit was restless, and rumors alone were enough to trigger entire migrations. Miners abandoned good-paying claims to chase wild reports of richer finds elsewhere, and California soon became a land of perpetual rushes. The Kern River excitement of 1855 drew some 5,000 hopefuls, most of them disappointed. Similar frenzies followed at the Walker River diggings, Truckee Lake, and the so-called Silver Mountain of 1850, which instead opened the way to Nevada's great silver fields. The Gold Lake hoax lured men into the Feather River country, while the tale of a lost cabin mine sent fruitless expeditions deep into the McLeod and Upper Sacramento country. Black Rock was said to hide a silver volcano, but offered nothing more than obsidian. Gold Bluff, near Trinidad Bay, promised riches washed up on the beach, but it too ended in failure. These excitements spilled across the map, into Oregon's Rogue and Umpqua rivers, Lower California and Sonora, even across the seas to Australia and South America. By 1858, the Fraser River strike in British Columbia drained 20,000 miners northward, showing how swiftly California's gold seekers could uproot themselves for the next horizon. In the absence of government oversight, the miners themselves created a unique code of laws and customs to govern this new chaotic world. Borrowing little from the Spanish system, Americans insisted on the principle that the land was free and that discovery alone conferred title. Mining districts held public meetings where men staked out rules, elected recorders, and marked their claims with stakes or ditches. The size of a claim might vary with the richness of the ground, but discoverers were generally entitled to their first choice, often double the size allotted to others. Rights depended on continuous work, and disputes were settled by committees or on the floor of a miners' meeting. These rough systems of frontier democracy proved so effective that they spread far beyond California, shaping the mining camps of Nevada, Montana, and Colorado in the years ahead. The United States government, surprisingly, took a hands-off approach. Unlike Spain, which had taxed and regulated every single ounce of its colonial ore, Washington refused to impose royalties or leases. Early proposals to tax or lease out the mines were met with fierce protests from the camps, and Congress ultimately accepted the free mining system the 49ers had already put in place. If the government stepped back, miners themselves were far less forgiving towards foreigners. Mexicans, Chileans, and later the Chinese were resented, not only out of prejudice, but because they were often more skilled and successful at extracting gold. Violence and expulsions became common, and the legislature added its own sanction in 1850 by imposing a foreign miners' tax of $20 per month. It was enforced mainly against Mexicans and Chinese, and drove thousands from the mines into poverty or banditry. Sonora, California, the center of Mexican settlement in the southern mines, became a flashpoint of arrests, expulsions, and violence. After protests, the tax was repealed in 1851, but only to be reinstated the following year at a lower but enduring rate. Mexicans, Chinese, and French miners bore the brunt of these harassments, seizures, and exclusion, while even native Californians, supposedly citizens of the United States, were pushed toward dispossession and despair. By the mid-1850s, the aforementioned anti-Chinese hostility had overtaken all others as the central feature of California's racial strife. As the surface gold dwindled, necessity forced men to innovate. The rocker and pan gave way to the long tom in 1850, which increased efficiency fivefold. Soon after, the sluice, little more than an extended long tom, multiplied yields further and became the miner's standard tool. River diversion, dredges, and beach sand experiments followed, though many failed. The real revolution came with hydraulic mining. Introduced in 1853, it used high-pressure water to wash down entire hillsides into sluices, replacing hundreds of laborers with sheer water power. Massive networks of ditches, flumes, and reservoirs sprang up to feed the monitors, and costs dropped from dollars per cubic yard to mere fractions of a cent. Meanwhile, some prospectors turned to quartz. From the earliest days, many believed the Great Mother Lode would be found in the hard rock veins of the Sierra. Excitement peaked in 1849 with discoveries in Mariposa, and the first quartz mill was built at Grass Valley in 1850. Assays promised ore 10 to 100 times richer than anything else abroad, but reality proved less generous. Surface pockets misled investors, recovery costs were far higher than expected, and ruin followed for many. Those with richer ledges or cheaper methods persevered, and by 1855, more than 60 mills were operating, producing over $4 million in gold. California, through trial and error, introduced innovations that stabilized the industry and gave quartz mining a real future. But it was the sheer variety of gold in California that fascinated miners most. In the Kern River, it ran pale with silver, and the Stanislaus, nearly pure. Butte County boasted the highest fineness, nearly 990 out of 1,000. Nuggets were rare, but legendary, and none more so than the Calaveras find of 1854, weighing in at 161 pounds and valued at $30,000. Carson Hill produced chiseled chunks worth $2 million, while Wood Creek and other Sonora diggings yielded rich pockets measured in pounds, not ounces. Even still, mining remained a lottery. One man might lift a fortune from the ground, while his neighbor earned nothing. Beginners stumbled into luck, while seasoned miners failed. On average, miners in 1852, the peak year for individual fortune seekers, earned about $600 apiece, barely $2 a day. Yet it was the allure of independence, the camp life, and the promise of treasure that kept men digging long after the richest placers were gone. For all but a few, the gold rush ended not with riches, but with survival, and sometimes not even that. By the early 1850s, California had become a golden engine feeding the world. In 1849 alone, the mines yielded some $40 million, and just 3 years later, that figure had climbed to $60 million, and production held at staggering levels for years to come. The growth was fueled by new territory, improved tools like the sluice and long tom, and eventually, in the might of hydraulic power and quartz mills. But the glitter of those figures hides the true cost. For every dollar of gold mined, an estimated $3 were consumed in the process, through equipment, labor, transport, and waste. Beyond the balance sheet, the losses were far grimmer. Drained treasuries in other nations, entire families broken apart, men dead from fever, accident, or violence. The gold rush had enriched the Union, but it also loosened morals, stoked vice and gambling, fueled crime and bloodshed, and left behind scars of thriftlessness and recklessness. Nature itself bore the deepest wounds. Fertile soils were washed away, hillsides were scoured bare, gravel deposits choked valleys, and streams once clear ran thick with mud and mercury. Yet from that chaos came transformation on a global scale. California's gold ignited commerce around the world, opening markets and giving struggling industries new lifelines. It inspired other stampedes, from British Columbia to Australia, and set in motion migrations that changed the face of continents. For the United States itself, the benefits were enormous. California's sudden wealth vaulted the young nation forward half a century in its Pacific ambitions. It spurred the building of the Panama Railway, the dream of a transcontinental steamship line, and later, the Great Overland Railroad. The lure of the Pacific helped open doors in China and Japan, and at home, it demonstrated how American democratic principles could thrive even in the wildest frontier. Out of wilderness, the miners built a settled, politically active society, all in a matter of years. And at the heart of this transformation lay the mining camps. The diggings were more than places of work. They were crucibles of self-government. Here, the principles of free land, equal rights, and recognition of discovery were hammered into custom. Miners prided themselves on equality. In theory, every man had a voice, though in practice, the loud and the bold often steered timid newcomers. And racial prejudice was rampant. And yet, the necessity of survival bound men of many nations together. The experience of overland caravans and frontier politics gave Americans a knack for organization, and partnerships became the glue of daily life. Camp governance was born of urgency. When disputes arose, miners held public meetings, drafted rules, and appointed officers. Entire committees emerged, often led by men with legal experience or simply a clear head. Claim size, tenure, and order in the camp were regulated article by article, voted on in the open air. Aforementioned recorders kept the rolls, registered claims, and mediated quarrels. In graver disputes, miners convened juries and judges on the spot. Periodic conventions addressed broader questions of order and improvement, and larger camps began to form permanent councils. Some smaller camps kept the alcalde system, borrowed from Mexican practice, but under Americans, it became less autocratic and more grounded in equity. In 1850, state law began to assert itself. Alcaldes were replaced by justices of the peace, and new towns hastily incorporated. Many of these early incorporations were driven by speculation, and corruption soon followed. Offices sold to the highest bidder, resources diverted, justice bent to shield the well-connected. Mining camps, for all their rough edges, often delivered swifter, harsher, but more impartial justice than the courts of San Francisco or Sacramento. The locations of these settlements were chosen not for comfort, but for proximity to gold. Tents and brush arbors gave way to sheds, frame houses, and finally brick structures, often built in the most inhospitable hollows, steep ravines, or sandy flats. Water was either too scarce or too abundant. Erosion plagued the works, and filth accumulated faster than improvements. And yet permanence crept in. Newspapers were printed, waterworks and sewers laid, gas lamps in the streets. Camps like Sonora, Columbia, Placerville, and Nevada City grew into towns and county seats, anchoring whole regions of trade and government. The names of these places carried their own frontier poetry. Some retained Spanish saintly titles. Others preserved indigenous terms, while Americans supplied a rougher lexicon: bar, flat, run, gulch. Many names came from incidents or men: Jackass Gulch, Poker Flat, Hangtown, each one a story etched into the map. In the end, the California 49ers not only stripped wealth from the soil, they carved an enduring landscape of towns, laws, and institutions that transformed California from a wild frontier into a state worthy of its golden name. The decline of California's mining camps came as quickly as their rise. Many collapsed within a few short years, abandoned once the easy surface gold ran dry. Instability defined the era. Fortunes made overnight could vanish just as fast through wild speculation, reckless gambling, or the simple exhaustion of pay dirt. Fires were common, often leveling entire towns in a matter of hours, and whole populations would uproot at the whisper of a richer strike elsewhere. Yet, not all the camps disappeared into the dust. Some endured by transforming into centers of hydraulic and quartz mining. Others shifted into farming villages or business towns, more orderly and permanent, where churches replaced saloons, and families settled where miners once gambled away their earnings. Agriculture often began in the humble garden patches of miners, nourished by the very ditches first dug to carry water to the sluices. Those very irrigation systems, initially built to wash down hillsides, would in time sustain vineyards, orchards, and farms. As the mining frontier retreated, regions found new life. El Dorado and Placer counties became known for their vineyards, Alpine for its pastures, and the once glittering gold belt gave way to tillable fields. In the South, San Diego and Los Angeles saw their prospects shift from quartz mining to agriculture, with oranges and irrigation promising steadier rewards than panning streams. Santa Barbara, plagued by drought, pivoted from ranching to farming. Migration followed these patterns too, first back to the coastal valleys in the 1850s, then to inland rivers where farming and mining overlapped, and eventually southward into ports, timberlands, and fishing grounds. The transformation was perhaps most visible in California's pueblos. In the South, disputes over land titles slowed growth at first, but waves of newcomers injected energy and capital. Old ranchos were divided, irrigation work spread, and once quiet pueblos swelled into bustling cities. The legacy was clear. From the wreckage of the rush, California's great urban and agricultural centers took root. modern industries carved out their own spaces. Eureka and Guerneville in lumber, Vallejo in flour, Soquel in tanning, Nortonville and New Almaden in coal and quicksilver, Martinez in fish canning, Alvarado in beet sugar, Boca in brewing, Newhall in oil. Education and institutions marked another branch of settlement, Berkeley, Benicia, and Santa Clara as college towns. Even leisure had its place, with Santa Cruz, Santa Barbara, Santa Monica, San Diego, Calistoga, and Auburn rising as resort destinations. By the railroad era, the fate of towns was determined less by the glitter of a gold pan than by the iron of the rails. Communities bypassed by the tracks withered, like San Juan Bautista and several San Joaquin Valley settlements. Others were revitalized by their new connections: Calistoga, Oroville, Sausalito. Entirely new towns sprang up along these railroads, booming into county seats: Modesto, Merced, Bakersfield, and Hollister. Speculation, however, never quite lost its grip on the California imagination. The fever that fueled mining ventures spilled into land schemes. During the first rush, and again in the 1860s, promoters mapped out, quote, paper towns, seizing land, dividing it into lots, and selling with wild promises. Prospective buyers were lured with glowing visions of future prosperity, while rifles and courtroom tricks were actually used to secure claims. Few of these ventures matched their boasts. Grand schemes like New York of the Pacific, along with Vernon and Klamath City, never rose beyond hamlets, and their dreams were left unrealized. Still, agriculture provided a more reliable path. Spanish settlements like San Jose, Los Angeles, Sonoma, those laid the groundwork, but American cooperative colonies soon reshaped the land. San Bernardino was founded by Mormon settlers, and Anaheim became a model horticultural settlement. Around Fresno and throughout the southern counties, clusters of wine and orchard colonies blossomed. In this, California's economy shifted from the gamble of mining and speculation towards the steady prosperity of farming and viticulture, an evolution that reshaped the Golden State long after the gold itself had dwindled. California has never been a land that stood still. From the moment Marshall's discovery set the world aflame, the Golden State became a place of constant reinvention. The gold rush gave way to agriculture. Agriculture gave way to railroads, and railroads gave way to cooperative colonies. Each transformation brought surprises of its own. Towns rose and fell with startling speed. Industries burned bright and vanished, and the rhythm of growth could be sudden and harsh, like the verdicts of the vigilance committees, or steady and majestic, like the rise of a vineyard on former mining grounds. The gold rush turned California from a distant province into the center of the world's imagination. Before 1848, the region counted only about 15,000 Europeans and Californios. Within a few years, hundreds of thousands poured in, transforming the territory's demographics almost overnight. Civic institutions followed. Settlers chartered towns, held a constitutional convention, drafting state constitutions and organizing elections. In less than 2 years, California was admitted to the Union as the 31st state, under the Compromise of 1850 on September 9th. A second gold rush soon followed. Not of ore, though, but of agriculture, as fields, orchards, and vineyards took precedent. Roads, schools, churches, and civic organizations multiplied, building permanence where chaos once reigned. San Francisco, which had counted just 500 people in 1847, boasted 150,000 by 1870. Improved transport knit the state to the east, first with the Panama Railway in 1855 and the ships of the Pacific Mail Steamship Company. The world, too, felt the shock. Farmers in Chile, Australia and Hawaii fed the miners. British manufacturers shipped the goods. China supplied prefabricated houses and clothing. And California gold itself poured into foreign markets, raising prices and spurring investment from London to Shanghai. In the United States, the sudden influx of gold upset the delicate bimetallic standard. With gold plentiful, silver lost value, fell out of circulation, and triggered a monetary shock that rippled through the international economy. The gold rush also laid the foundation for a greater conquest, the Transcontinental Railroad. Its groundbreaking in Sacramento in 1863 was funded in part by profits from the mines, and by 1869, the line was complete. California was no longer months away by ship or wagon train. It was days away by rail. The Pacific was, at last, joined to the Atlantic. Back in the mining camps, the strange and often lawless society of young men bent the rules of gender as well. With so few women present, men sometimes dressed in women's garb for dances or domestic duties. At gatherings, something as simple as a kerchief or sackcloth patch might stand in for a woman's role. The scarcity of women also meant they were idolized when present. Sex workers dominated early public life, but as the families arrived, respectability slowly took hold. Culturally, the gold rush forged what became known as the, quote, California Dream. Older notions of the American dream, rooted in slow, steady accumulation through thrift and hard work, gave way to an ideal of sudden wealth through boldness and luck. In California, one strike could have changed everything, and that promise of instant success became woven into the American psyche long after the last nuggets had been panned from the rivers. The state itself embraced this legacy. Eureka became the motto. The highway shield was shaped like a miner's spade, and State Route 49 wound its way through the heart of gold country. Entire towns, such as Columbia, preserved their gold rush districts as monuments to a fevered age. But beneath the wealth lay a devastating cost. The environment was left scarred beyond repair. Fertile soils were washed away, rivers choked with gravel and silt, fish runs destroyed, forests stripped, and habitats poisoned by mercury and other chemicals. Native Californians bore the worst of it. Seen as obstacles to progress, they suffered mass killings at the hands of miners and militias. Some days saw 50 or more indigenous people murdered at once. Retaliation and reprisal spiraled into massacres, often directed at tribes who had played no role in earlier violence. In 1852, settlers slaughtered more than 150 Wintu in the Bridge Gulch Massacre. Only 3 children survived. Historian Benjamin Madley estimates that between 1846 and 1873, between 9,400 and 16,000 California Indians were killed in more than 370 separate massacres. The state itself bore responsibility. California refused to ratify 18 treaties negotiated with tribal leaders in 1851, effectively denying natives any recognized land rights. In contrast, the government did fund paramilitary expeditions with over $1 million in appropriations. Governor Peter Burnett declared that a war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct. He was framing genocide as the will of God. The 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of Indians legalized bonded labor and slavery, barring native testimony against settlers, and allowing the adoption of native children, often in practice a cover for kidnapping and forced servitude. Other groups faced harsh treatment as well. Once the richest ground was gone, Americans turned their frustration against foreign miners, particularly Mexicans, Chileans, and Chinese. Laws like the foreign miners tax combined with mob violence and vigilante intimidation, drove many from the diggings. Entire Mexican communities, like Sonora, resisted but faced arrests, expulsions, and assaults. Some, stripped of livelihood, became outlaws, further feeding cycles of violence. Anti-Chinese sentiment grew even more pronounced by the mid-1850s, laying groundwork for the exclusionary policies that would follow in the later decades. Even for Americans, the toll was steep. Roughly 1 in 12 49ers died, often from disease, violence, or accidents. Crime and disorder plagued the boomtowns, where vigilance committees and mob justice filled the void left by weak courts and corrupt officials. By the time the easy gold was gone, California had already been remade. Its rivers were scarred, its hills reshaped, and its native peoples decimated. Yet from the chaos of the diggings grew farms, towns, railroads, and the foundation of the modern state. The gold rush gave California its identity, the promise that boldness and a little bit of luck could change a life overnight, and with it, help redefine the American dream. The echoes of that fever still linger today in Silicon Valley startups, in Hollywood pictures, and the enduring belief that in California, everything and anything is possible. The gold fever is long over, but its legacy still runs deep in the veins of the Golden State. In the end, the flakes at Sutter Mill and the migration that followed left California transformed, its wealth and promise undeniable, but its scars and sins just as vivid. There may not be a more apt piece of history or lore that reveals the true American experience than the legendary California Gold Rush.